Rivalries are what make the game, really. It's what keeps teams competitive and fans on the edge of their seats. The intensity can be felt from miles away once teams that truly hate each other take the ice. In this video, I'm going to attempt to cover each NHL team's biggest rivalry. So let's get to it, shall we? Now, you might be wondering, how can two teams that have only met once in the postseason hate each other so much? Well, sometimes close proximity just kinda breeds a distaste of its own, really. As the Anaheim-LA rivalry was even given its own name, the Freeway Face-Off, which was coined originally due to both teams' arenas being connected by one single roadway, Interstate 5. And usually, when these two Californian squads take the ice, things tend to get ugly. Like 3 fights in 4 seconds kinda ugly. I'll just leave it at that. So usually when your team pretty much gets stolen out from under you, well, you're naturally going to despise the city it goes off to, at least if you're a fan. And in Arizona's point of view, the Coyotes were the team rumored at one point to be returning to Winnipeg. But as we all know, the Thrashers were the casualty at the time. Even though these two have been in separate divisions since the Jets came back into the league, the rivalry between them will definitely be heating up once the Coyotes join the Central Division. Possibly one of the most bitter rivalries in NHL history to come about is the one between the Bruins and the Habs. Aside from the fact that they've been versing one another for almost a century, their rivalry really came about after they were both placed in the same division. With Montreal having the reputation of being the best hockey team ever, and Boston gaining their own reputation with names like Bobby Orr and Phil Esposito of being the best in the States, things were bound to heat up. Both squads have played one another more than any other two teams in NHL history to date, with Montreal having the current edge on the Bees as the only team currently in the Eastern Conference possessing a winning record against Boston. As you'll quickly learn, Boston is one of the most hated teams in the league, and the Sabres' reasoning for despising the ones in black and yellow has existed pretty much since their inception, in 1970. Besides the fact that the two teams have met in the playoffs for 8 series, and the Bruins winning 5 of them, the Bees were responsible more recently for the vicious hit to the Sabres' goaltender at the time, Ryan Miller, who said on live TV during a post-game interview that Milan Lucic, the perpetrator, was a POS. I'll just let you guys figure out what that abbreviation means. In case you've never watched a game between these two teams, let me enlighten you just a little. It looks a lot like this, or maybe this, and even this. Okay, you obviously get the picture by now, as both teams certifiably hate each other, and have for years really, like almost 40 to be exact, as the Flames joined the Oil as the other NHL team present in Alberta in 1980. And towards the end of the decade, both teams with players such as Wayne Gretzky, Mark Messier, Al McGuinness, and Doug Gilmour in the mix were arguably two of the best in the league at the time, as at least one of the squads was present in the Stanley Cup Finals from 1983 to 1990. Anyways, both teams came away successfully, but not without gaining a pure distaste for one another, and continue to keep the rivalry alive as what's known as the Battle for Alberta. Possibly the youngest rivalry yet on this list, as its inception, as we all know, came about recently during last postseason. Let's see, on Washington's end, they've gotta be pretty bitter still yet after getting shown by the Canes, and as Stanley Cup champions, losing to a team that hasn't made the playoffs in around a decade has to hurt, like, a lot. And as far as the bunch of jerks are concerned, the fact that the Caps captain dropped Andrei Svechnikov in one punch during the series and injuring the 19-year-old probably didn't sit too well either in Raleigh. Just saying. You ever heard the saying, "I went to a fight and a hockey game broke out"? Well, that's pretty much how it was during the 1980s to early 90s, as both teams were exceptionally skilled and routinely faced one another in the postseason. And besides sharing multiple postseason appearances, they mutually had arguably the two loudest arenas at the time in the league. But honestly, it doesn't have to be the postseason for things to get ugly between these two, as the well-known St. Patrick's Day massacre that took place in 1991, and in case the name didn't give it away, during the 6-4 win by Chicago, 270 penalty minutes were dealt, 12 players were ejected, and both teams were fined $10,000. Since that day, well, the rivalry has been much alive and well between the two teams. During the mid-1990s to the early millennium, there wasn't a more vicious rivalry in the league than that of the Avalanche and Red Wings. Aside from a few key moments that only fueled the fire between the two teams, they were also playing some of the best hockey to date, as the two teams combined for 5 Stanley Cups in a 7-year span. And besides both being highly skilled around the same time as I mentioned, there were specific turning points between the two that came about in the postseason of 1996, including the most notable, the hit from Claude Lemieux on Chris Draper, that shattered the forward's jaw, cheekbone, and nose. And of course, the most brutal game to date, a massive brawl that resulted in 18 fighting majors in a spirited battle between goaltenders at the time, Patrick Roy and Mike Vernon. Even though the rivalry has simmered down over the years, the history between both teams is unforgettable. Another rivalry birthed out of close proximity is the one between the Blue Jackets and Penguins. Not only has the small distance between the two teams, which is only around 3 hours by car, ignited the rivalry, but also the conference realignment, as both teams, as of the 2013-14 season, began sharing the same division. This, of course, allowed for even more competition, and many Penguins fans, including myself, are often seen at Nationwide Arena, which makes it even more intense. And when they do face one another, well, you best be prepared for a tough and physical style of play, along with a side of frequent post-whistle scrums. Besides their 2 postseason series thus far displayed, the bad blood has only intensified over the years, partially due to the individual rivalry between the Penguins captain Sidney Crosby and alternate captain Brandon Dubinsky. Considering the fact that the Stars are decently isolated in comparison to their counterparts, they don't exactly have quite as bitter feuds as other teams. But one rivalry that has come about over the years is the one that the Stars share with the Nashville Predators. Similarly to the Columbus-Pittsburgh rivalry, the bad blood didn't come about until both squads were routinely facing one another in the same division. A few notable moments from the Stars' perspective include Jamie Benn securing the franchise's first ever Art Ross trophy in a 4-1 win over the Predators, and a not-so-happy moment as the Stars in 2017 blew a 3-0 lead and fell to Nashville 5-3. The match, as you would expect, ended in frustration on the Stars' end, but was entertaining nonetheless, with 3 fights and 58 penalty minutes. Definitely not the most bitter rivalry here, but even still, when fights are breaking out between fans during games, well, it's gotta be at least notable. Am I right? Anyways, the Lightning, who have routinely gotten the best of their interstate rival, sorry Panthers fans, have pretty much been doing so since day one, as both teams have been in the same division since the Panthers' inception in 1993. So why then, you have to be asking, isn't there more to talk about here? Well, to be honest, it has a lot to do with the fact that both Floridian teams have yet to meet one another in the postseason, or any sort of outdoor game. Therefore, yes, the potential for a real rivalry is evident, but the Panthers need to make the playoffs first. Okay, I really didn't mean to rip any Cats fans. Please forgive me,